When 28-year-old travel blogger Nina Caldwell failed to post her daily update from the remote Alaskan wilderness, her followers initially assumed it was just poor cell service. But for her father, the silence that stretched beyond her planned check-in time triggered an alarm that had been quietly building in his chest for years. His independent daughter had been documenting solo adventures across the globe for her popular blog Wandering Nina for nearly 5 years, and she had never, not once, missed a scheduled contact. Search teams would eventually comb through hundreds of square miles of unforgiving Alaskan terrain, but they found nothing. No trace, no clues, no sign that Nina Caldwell had ever existed beyond the last cheerful post on her blog. Then 3 years later, a local fishing guide spotted something unusual beneath the crystal-clear waters of a remote mountain lake. Something bright red and waterlogged that didn't belong in the pristine wilderness. What lay wrapped inside that crimson bundle would shatter every assumption about what had happened to the missing blogger. The morning of September 15, 2016, dawned crisp and clear in Anchorage, Alaska. Nina Caldwell stood in the lobby of her modest hotel, her red North Face sleeping bag strapped prominently to the top of her well-worn hiking pack. At 28, she had transformed her wanderlust into a thriving online business, documenting her solo adventures for an audience of nearly 200,000 devoted followers. Her blog, Wandering Nina, had become a beacon for young women seeking to explore the world on their own terms. She was methodical in her planning, obsessive about safety protocols, and religious about maintaining contact with both her audience and her family. Her father, Robert Caldwell, a retired postal worker from Minneapolis, had long ago learned to manage his worry by focusing on his daughter's competence. Nina wasn't reckless. She was a former Eagle Scout, certified in wilderness first aid, and carried more emergency equipment than some professional guides. Their agreement was simple but non-negotiable. She would send him a brief text message every 24 hours during any solo expedition, just 2 words that let him know she was safe and on schedule. The message was always the same, all good, followed by her location. It was their ritual, their lifeline across the vast distances that separated his quiet suburban life from her grand adventures. Nina's Alaskan expedition was ambitious even by her standards. She planned to spend 10 days hiking through the remote Brooks Range, a vast wilderness area north of the Arctic Circle where grizzly bears outnumbered humans by overwhelming margins. Her route would take her through valleys that few people ever saw, across rivers that appeared on no tourist maps, and over mountain passes where the aurora borealis danced overhead in September's lengthening nights. She had spent months preparing, studying topographical maps, researching wildlife patterns and coordinating supply drops with a local outfitter. Her blog posts in the weeks leading up to the trip buzzed with excitement and detailed preparation updates that her followers had come to love. On the morning of her departure, she posted a final update to her blog. The entry was vintage Nina, equal parts practical and poetic. She wrote about the weight of her pack, the contents of her first aid kit, and the 3 different backup communication devices she carried. But she also wrote about the pull she felt toward the vast emptiness, the desire to stand in a place where human footprints were rare enough to feel like discoveries. The post concluded with a promise to her readers: 10 days in the land of the midnight sun, where the only Wi-Fi is the connection between soul and wilderness. See you on the other side of amazing. It was accompanied by a selfie taken in her hotel lobby, Nina grinning beneath the brim of her well-worn hiking hat, her red sleeping bag visible like a beacon of adventure strapped to her pack. Robert had driven from Minneapolis to Anchorage to see her off, a 3,400-mile journey that spoke to both his love and his persistent anxiety. They spent her last evening in civilization at a small restaurant overlooking Cook Inlet, sharing salmon and stories. Nina walked him through her route one final time, pointing to waypoints on her laminated map, explaining her backup plans and emergency protocols. She showed him her satellite communicator, a device that would allow her to send messages even from the remotest locations. She demonstrated how it worked, sending him a test message that appeared on his phone as if by magic. Day 0, all good Anchorage, it read, followed by precise GPS coordinates. The next morning, Robert drove her to the small airport where she would catch a charter flight to the remote village of Kobuk, her jumping-off point into the wilderness. He watched her board the tiny 6-seat plane, her pack filling most of the cargo space, her confident wave from the window both reassuring and heartbreaking. As the plane disappeared into the vast Alaskan sky, he felt the familiar mixture of pride and terror that had become the emotional backdrop of her adventures. The first day passed exactly as planned. At 6 p.m. Alaska time, Robert's phone chimed with the expected message. Day 1, all good, Brooks Range in trance. The coordinates showed she had successfully reached her first planned camping spot, a scenic ridge overlooking the Kobuk River Valley. Robert replied with their standard response, "Love you, be safe," and settled into the rhythm of worry that would define the next 9 days. Day 2 brought another punctual message, this one from deeper in the wilderness where few people ever ventured. Day 3 arrived on schedule, showing she had successfully crossed her first major river and was making good time toward the mountain pass that marked the halfway point of her journey. Her messages were sparse by necessity, limited by the satellite device's character restrictions, but they painted a picture of steady progress through some of the most remote terrain in North America. On the 4th day, September 19th, the message came 3 hours late. Day 4, all good, weather delay. Robert felt his stomach tighten, but he understood. Weather in the Brooks Range could change without warning, and Nina was smart enough to wait out dangerous conditions. The coordinates showed she was camped in a protected valley, exactly where someone should be if storms were moving through. Day 5 brought silence. 6 p.m. Alaska time came and went without the familiar chime of his phone. Robert stared at the device, willing it to light up with Nina's simple reassurance. 7 p.m. passed, then 8. He tried to rationalize the delay. Maybe her device was malfunctioning, maybe she was in a dead zone, maybe she was simply too tired after a difficult day to remember their routine. But Nina never forgot. Even on her most challenging expeditions, through monsoons in Southeast Asia and sandstorms in the Sahara, the message always came. By midnight, Robert's worry had crystallized into cold certainty. Something was wrong. He spent the sleepless hours until dawn researching emergency protocols, identifying who to call and what to say. At 6 a.m. Minneapolis time, he placed the call that would launch one of the largest search and rescue operations in recent Alaskan history. The Alaska State Troopers took his report seriously. Nina's reputation as a careful, experienced hiker preceded her, and her sudden silence was immediately classified as a high-priority missing person case. Within hours, the search machinery was mobilized. Helicopter crews from the Alaska National Guard were placed on standby, local search and rescue volunteers were contacted, and park rangers familiar with the Brooks Range were pulled from other assignments. The challenge facing the search teams was overwhelming. The Brooks Range encompasses over 8 million acres of roadless wilderness, an area larger than Maryland. Nina's planned route covered roughly 120 miles of that vastness, threading through valleys and overpasses where visibility from aircraft was limited by terrain and weather. Her last known position placed her in the heart of the range, days of hiking from the nearest road, in country where a person could disappear completely just by stepping behind a boulder. The first search aircraft launched on September 21st, 4 days after Nina's last communication. The helicopter crew, veterans of dozens of wilderness rescues, flew grid patterns over her planned route, their eyes straining to spot the bright colors that might indicate a tent, a backpack, or an emergency signal. They found nothing but endless tundra, jagged peaks, and the occasional caribou herd moving like shadows across the landscape. Ground teams were inserted at key points along her route, experienced trackers who could read the subtle signs of human passage in a land where such signs were rare and precious. They found no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no indication that Nina Caldwell had ever walked those ancient paths. For 2 weeks, the search continued with the intensity and coordination of a military operation. Fixed-wing aircraft equipped with high-resolution cameras photographed every square mile of Nina's intended route, creating a detailed photographic record that analysts would study for weeks. Thermal imaging equipment was deployed to detect heat signatures that might indicate a stranded hiker, and specialized mountain rescue teams rappelled into remote canyons where a fall victim might lie hidden from aerial view. The Coast Guard contributed helicopters equipped with sophisticated search equipment, their crews pushing the limits of their aircraft's range to reach the most remote corners of the Brooks Range. Robert Caldwell flew to Alaska and established himself at the Search Command Center in Fairbanks, a converted conference room that became the nerve center for the massive operation. The walls were covered with topographical maps marked with search grids, weather reports, and photos of Nina taken from her blog. He sat quietly in the corner, staying out of the way but refusing to leave, as if his presence might somehow guide the searchers to his daughter. He watched experienced rescue coordinators plot search patterns with military precision, listened to radio chatter from helicopter crews reporting negative results, and felt his hope diminish with each passing day. The searchers found traces of other hikers from previous seasons, remnants of camps and fire rings that served as proof that humans had passed through the wilderness before. They discovered the remains of a small aircraft that had crashed decades earlier, its wreckage slowly being reclaimed by the tundra. They located several caribou carcasses and bear signs that reminded everyone of the dangers lurking in the vast wilderness. But of Nina Caldwell they found absolutely nothing. As September turned to October, the harsh reality of Alaskan weather began to dictate the search parameters. Snow was falling regularly above 3,000 feet, and the brief daylight hours made aerial searches increasingly difficult. The initial urgency that had driven the massive search effort slowly gave way to the grim acknowledgement that they were no longer looking for a rescue, but for a recovery. The official search was scaled back, then reluctantly suspended as winter settled over the Brooks Range like a thick, white curtain. The case was assigned to Detective Janet Powell, a 15-year veteran of the Alaska State Troopers who specialized in missing persons cases in remote areas. Powell was a methodical investigator who understood the unique challenges of wilderness disappearances in Alaska, where the line between adventure and tragedy was often measured in degrees of temperature or miles from help. She had worked dozens of similar cases over her career, and she knew that the vast majority ended with the discovery of remains years later, usually by hunters or hikers who stumbled across what the wilderness had claimed. Powell's investigation began with a thorough review of Nina's digital footprint. Unlike the random hiker who might disappear without documentation, Nina had left behind a detailed electronic trail of her life and plans. Powell studied every blog post, examined every photo, and analyzed every comment from Nina's followers. She built a timeline of Nina's movements in the days before her departure, interviewed the hotel staff who had interacted with her, and spoke with the charter pilot who had flown her to Kobuk Village. The pilot, a grizzled veteran named Jack Morrison who had been flying in Alaska for over 20 years, provided useful insight into Nina's mindset during the flight. He described her as confident and well-prepared, someone who clearly understood the risks she was taking. She had asked intelligent questions about weather patterns and wildlife activity, and she had studied her maps during the entire 90-minute flight. Nothing in their conversation suggested someone planning anything other than a challenging but routine solo hike. Powell also conducted extensive interviews with Nina's online community. The travel blogging world was tight-knit, and Nina was well regarded among her peers for her safety-conscious approach and detailed preparation. Several other bloggers confirmed that Nina had reached out before her trip, asking for advice about specific gear and route planning. The conversations were all consistent with someone planning a legitimate expedition, not someone preparing to disappear voluntarily. As winter deepened and the Brooks Range became completely inaccessible, Powell focused on the possibility that Nina had never reached her intended destination. She retraced Nina's movements from the moment she landed in Kobuk Village, a settlement of fewer than 200 people where strangers were immediately noticed and remembered. The village residents confirmed that Nina had arrived as scheduled, had spent one night in the local bed and breakfast, and had set out the next morning with her pack loaded and her spirits high. A local teenager had even helped her carry her gear to the traditional starting point of the hiking trail, a weathered wooden sign that marked the boundary between civilization and true wilderness. The investigation hit its first major puzzle when Powell examined the satellite communicator data. The device Nina carried was designed to work anywhere on Earth, sending signals through a network of satellites that could relay messages even from the most remote locations. The company's technical specialists provided detailed logs showing that Nina's device had successfully sent her scheduled messages on days 1, 2, and 3. On day 4, the delayed message had been sent from coordinates that matched her planned route. After that, the device had gone completely silent. The technical analysis revealed something troubling. The device showed no signs of malfunction, no error messages, and no indication of damage. It had simply stopped transmitting, as if it had been deliberately turned off or destroyed. The specialists explained that even severe weather wouldn't cause such a complete cessation of signal. The device was designed to continue attempting to connect and would send diagnostic information even if it couldn't complete a full message transmission. The sudden, total silence suggested either catastrophic destruction of the device or intentional deactivation. Powell expanded her investigation to examine whether Nina might have encountered other people in the wilderness. The Brooks Range, despite its vastness, attracted a small but dedicated community of extreme hikers, hunters, and researchers. She compiled lists of everyone who had permits or plans to be in the area during September 2016. The process was complicated by the fact that much of the Brooks Range was public land that didn't require permits, meaning that people could enter and exit without any official record of their presence. She discovered that a geological survey team had been working in the region during Nina's planned timeframe, conducting mineral assessments for a mining company. The team consisted of 3 geologists who had been camping and moving through the area for several weeks. Powell contacted the mining company and arranged interviews with all 3 team members. Each man was thoroughly vetted, their movements documented, and their backgrounds examined. All 3 had solid alibis and credible explanations for their activities. Their work sites were miles from Nina's intended route, and their timeline didn't intersect with her disappearance window. By spring of 2017, the case had grown cold in every practical sense. Powell maintained an open file and continued to follow up on occasional tips, but the trail had gone silent. Robert Caldwell returned to Minneapolis, but he refused to give up hope. He hired a private investigator, spent his retirement savings on additional search efforts, and maintained Nina's blog as a memorial and a beacon for anyone who might have information about his daughter's fate. The annual visitor count to Wandering Nina gradually declined as the internet moved on to newer stories and fresh tragedies. The case received periodic media attention, particularly around the anniversary of Nina's disappearance. Local Alaska newspapers would run retrospective articles, and hiking safety organizations would cite her case as an example of how even experienced adventurers could vanish without a trace. But as months turned to years, even these mentions became less frequent. Nina Caldwell had joined the ranks of Alaska's missing, one of dozens of people who had walked into the wilderness and never walked out. If you're fascinated by unsolved mysteries and want to hear more incredible true stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next in this incredible case. Detective Powell periodically reviewed the file, always hoping that advancing technology or new information might provide a breakthrough. She studied satellite imagery from the time period, looking for any anomalies or signs of disturbance. She consulted with wilderness survival experts and cold case specialists from other jurisdictions. Every lead was pursued, every theory examined, but the Brooks Range had swallowed Nina Caldwell as completely as if she had never existed. The vast wilderness held its silence, and the mystery deepened with each passing season. 3 years had passed since Nina Caldwell vanished into the Alaskan wilderness, and the case had settled into the quiet desperation that characterizes long-term missing person investigations. Detective Powell still carried the file in her active caseload, but the leads had dried up completely. The Brooks Range had claimed Nina as thoroughly as it had claimed dozens of others over the decades, leaving behind only questions and the persistent ache of unresolved loss. Robert Caldwell marked each anniversary with a renewed plea for information, posting updated missing person flyers on social media and hiking forums, but the responses grew fewer each year. The world had moved on, but a father's hope remained stubbornly alive. The breakthrough that would resurrect the case came from an entirely unexpected location, hundreds of miles south of Nina's last known position. On a brilliant morning in late June 2019, two recreational kayakers were exploring the remote waters of Glacier Bay National Park, paddling through pristine wilderness that few tourists ever experienced. The pair, longtime friends Danny Kowalski and his college roommate Alex Reed, had planned the trip for months as a celebration of Danny's recent promotion to park ranger. Both men were experienced outdoorsmen who relished the opportunity to explore areas accessible only by water, where the silence was broken only by the splash of paddles and the occasional call of eagles overhead. Kowalski had grown up in Alaska and possessed the kind of intuitive wilderness knowledge that comes from a lifetime spent in remote places. Reed was visiting from Colorado, a software engineer whose passion for outdoor photography had brought him north to capture the raw beauty of untouched Alaska. Their kayaks cut silent wakes through water so clear and still that it seemed like paddling through liquid glass. The lake they were exploring, known locally as Mirror Lake, was a hidden gem nestled between towering peaks, accessible only by a challenging portage from the main waterway. The lake was aptly named. Its surface reflected the surrounding mountains and sky with such perfect clarity that it was difficult to determine where reality ended and reflection began. The water was extraordinarily transparent, a phenomenon caused by the lack of sediment and the natural filtration provided by the glacier that fed it. Visibility extended down 30 feet or more, revealing the rocky bottom and the occasional fish that darted between submerged boulders like silver ghosts in an underwater cathedral. It was Reed who spotted it first, his photographer's eye trained to notice anything that disrupted natural patterns. They were drifting near the lake center, taking a break from paddling to eat lunch and soak in the spectacular scenery, when something caught his attention in the depths below. At first glance, it appeared to be a large piece of debris, something red and unnatural resting on the lake bottom. He pointed it out to Kowalski, who initially dismissed it as trash left by careless visitors, an unfortunately common sight even in the most remote locations. But as their kayaks drifted closer and the angle of light changed, both men realized they were looking at something far more disturbing than simple litter. The red object was clearly artificial, but its shape and the way it rested on the bottom suggested something heavy and deliberately placed. Kowalski, with his ranger training, immediately recognized the potential significance. In his years working Alaska's wilderness, he had encountered enough grim discoveries to know that anything unusual deserved serious attention. The water was deep enough to require diving equipment for close examination, but clear enough to make out details that sent chills through both men. The object appeared to be cylindrical and bound with what looked like rope or wire. Dark shapes were visible around its base, objects that were clearly not natural to the lake environment. Reed, fighting his curiosity, began taking photographs with his waterproof camera, documenting the scene from multiple angles while Kowalski used his GPS device to record precise coordinates. Both men understood the gravity of what they might have stumbled upon. Alaska's wilderness held many secrets, and not all of them were natural. The remote location, the deliberate placement, and the obvious effort required to reach the lake all suggested something far more sinister than accidental loss. After documenting everything they could from the surface, they made the difficult decision to paddle back to civilization and contact authorities immediately. The nearest ranger station was a full day's paddle and portage away, but Kowalski's status as a park employee gave their report immediate credibility. By evening, they had reached the station and placed the call that would set a new investigation in motion. Kowalski spoke with his supervisor, carefully describing what they had observed and providing the GPS coordinates. The supervisor, understanding the potential implications, immediately contacted the Alaska State Troopers and the FBI field office in Anchorage. Within 48 hours, Mirror Lake was the center of intense law enforcement activity. A specialized dive team from the state police arrived via helicopter, along with crime scene technicians and investigators experienced in underwater evidence recovery. The remote location made logistics challenging, requiring multiple helicopter trips to transport personnel and equipment to the pristine lake that had suddenly become a potential crime scene. Detective Powell, despite the distance from her Brooks Range case, volunteered to observe the recovery operation. Something about the remote location and the deliberate concealment reminded her of other unsolved cases, and she had learned to trust her instincts about patterns that might not be immediately obvious to others. She arrived at Mirror Lake on the second day of the operation, watching from shore as divers prepared for their descent into the crystalline depths. The underwater recovery was a delicate operation conducted with the precision of an archaeological dig. The lead diver, Sergeant Tom Wallace, was a veteran of dozens of underwater crime scenes who understood the importance of preserving evidence while working in the challenging environment beneath the surface. The water temperature was barely above freezing, limiting dive times and requiring careful coordination between surface support and the divers below. Wallace's first close examination confirmed their worst fears. The red object was indeed a sleeping bag, high-quality outdoor gear that had been deliberately weighted down with what appeared to be climbing hardware and rocks gathered from the shore. The binding was methodical, professional, suggesting someone with knowledge of how to ensure that submerged objects would remain hidden. Most disturbing was the obvious bulk within the sleeping bag, a shape that was unmistakably human. The recovery took most of the day, with divers working in careful shifts to photograph everything in place before beginning the delicate process of bringing the bundle to the surface. The weights were removed and catalogued separately, each piece of hardware potentially containing fingerprints or other forensic evidence. The sleeping bag itself was lifted with extreme care, water streaming from its saturated fabric as it broke the surface after 3 years in the lake's depths. On shore, the medical examiner and forensic team waited with the equipment necessary to process what everyone understood would be human remains. The sleeping bag was placed on sterile tarps and photographed from every angle before the painstaking process of examination began. The fabric was a distinctive red color with black trim, high-end gear that suggested an experienced outdoor enthusiast. Despite 3 years underwater, the synthetic materials had preserved remarkably well in the lake's cold, clean environment. When the sleeping bag was carefully opened, the team faced the grim task of examining severely decomposed remains. The cold water had slowed decomposition significantly, but 3 years had still taken their toll. What was immediately apparent was that the victim was female, based on clothing remnants and physical characteristics that had survived the years underwater. Personal items were scattered throughout the bundle, small objects that had been trapped within the sleeping bag during whatever violent event had led to this grim discovery. Among the debris, investigators found fragments of hiking gear, pieces of a destroyed GPS device, and most significantly, a waterproof pouch containing identification documents. The plastic had protected the contents from complete destruction, though water damage made some items difficult to read. When Detective Powell saw the name on the driver's license, her breath caught in her throat. The identification belonged to Nina Caldwell, the missing travel blogger whose case had haunted her for 3 years. The discovery sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and beyond. The travel blogging world erupted with speculation and grief as news of the find spread across social media. Robert Caldwell received the call he had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure, the confirmation that his daughter was dead, but also the end of 3 years of agonizing uncertainty. The case that had been declared cold was suddenly blazing hot again, with new questions that were even more troubling than the original mystery. The most pressing question was location. Mirror Lake was over 400 miles southeast of Nina's planned hiking route in the Brooks Range, a journey that would have been impossible for her to make on foot and completely inconsistent with her documented plans and preparations. The geographical impossibility of Nina's location became the central focus of the renewed investigation. Detective Powell spread a large map across the conference table at the Anchorage field office, marking Nina's last known position in the Brooks Range with a red pin and Mirror Lake with a black one. The distance between them was staggering, over 400 miles of some of the most difficult terrain in North America. There was no logical explanation for how Nina could have traveled from her planned route to the remote lake where her body was discovered. The forensic examination of Nina's remains provided more questions than answers. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Hawkins, conducted a thorough analysis despite the challenges posed by 3 years of cold water immersion. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the skull, indicating that Nina had been murdered rather than fallen victim to the wilderness accidents that claimed most missing hikers. The pattern of injuries suggested a deliberate attack with a heavy object, possibly a rock or piece of camping equipment. More troubling was the evidence surrounding the disposal of the body. The sleeping bag that contained Nina's remains was not the red North Face bag she had carried on her trip. Forensic analysis revealed it to be a different brand entirely, a high-end mountaineering bag that retailed for over $600. The weights used to sink the bundle included professional climbing hardware, expensive carabiners and pitons that suggested someone with serious mountaineering experience. This wasn't a crime of opportunity committed by a random attacker. It was a calculated disposal that required planning, resources, and intimate knowledge of remote wilderness areas. Detective Powell assembled a task force that included FBI specialists in wilderness crimes and behavioral analysts experienced in tracking predators who used remote locations to conceal their activities. The team's first priority was reconstructing Nina's movements from her last confirmed location to determine how she had ended up hundreds of miles from her planned route. They began by re-examining every piece of evidence from the original investigation, looking for clues they might have missed 3 years earlier. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While reviewing Nina's blog archives, FBI analyst Dr. Rachel Stone noticed something that previous investigators had overlooked. In the weeks before her Alaska trip, Nina had received several comments on her blog from someone using the handle Alaska Guide 47. The comments were encouraging and informative, offering detailed advice about weather conditions, wildlife behavior, and route recommendations. To casual readers, they appeared to be helpful tips from an experienced local outdoorsman. Dr. Stone's behavioral analysis training made her suspicious of the pattern. The comments showed an escalating level of personal interest in Nina's specific plans, with increasingly detailed suggestions about route modifications and alternative destinations. The commenters seemed to have extensive knowledge of remote areas that didn't appear on standard hiking maps, including several mentions of hidden gems that only locals knew about. Most concerning was a private message exchange that Nina had apparently had with this person, references to which appeared in her final blog posts. The task force immediately began the complex process of tracing the digital identity of Alaska Guide 47. The trail led through multiple proxy servers and anonymous email accounts, suggesting someone with technical sophistication who understood how to hide their online activities. However, investigators got a break when they discovered that one of the early comments had been posted from an IP address registered to a small internet cafe in Fairbanks, Alaska. The cafe owner, Maria Gonzalez, remembered the regular customer who had used the terminal during the time frame in question. She described him as a middle-aged man with extensive outdoor gear who paid in cash and kept to himself. More importantly, she had security footage from the relevant dates. The grainy images showed a tall, bearded man in his 40s wearing expensive hiking boots and a well-worn jacket. The footage wasn't clear enough for facial recognition, but it provided the first visual evidence of someone who might be connected to Nina's disappearance. Detectives canvassed outdoor gear stores throughout Alaska, showing the security footage and asking about customers who matched the physical description. The state's outdoor community was small enough that experienced guides and serious mountaineers were often known by name at specialty equipment shops. After weeks of investigation, they received a promising lead from a store owner in Anchorage who recognized the man's distinctive gait and clothing style. The store owner identified the customer as someone who went by the name Bear Thompson, a freelance wilderness guide who specialized in taking wealthy clients to remote locations for extreme hiking and climbing experiences. Thompson wasn't licensed with any official guide service, operating instead through word-of-mouth referrals and online forums. He was known for his knowledge of hidden locations and his willingness to take clients to places that mainstream guide services wouldn't consider. The investigation into Thompson revealed a troubling pattern. Over the past decade, he had been peripherally connected to several missing person cases in remote wilderness areas across Alaska and Western Canada. In each instance, hikers had disappeared after expressing interest in off-trail adventures or seeking guides for extremely remote destinations. The cases had never been connected because they occurred in different jurisdictions and were often classified as wilderness accidents rather than potential crimes. Thompson's background check revealed a history of minor infractions with park services and a reputation among legitimate guides as someone who operated in ethical gray areas. He was known to charge exorbitant fees for taking clients to dangerous locations, often without proper permits or safety protocols. Several former clients had complained about his erratic behavior and inappropriate comments about female hikers, but none had filed formal charges. The task force obtained search warrants for Thompson's known addresses, but they discovered he lived a nomadic lifestyle, moving between remote cabins and campsites throughout the Alaska wilderness. His most recent known residence was a cabin near Denali National Park, but when investigators arrived, they found it had been abandoned for months. Neighbors reported seeing Thompson loading his truck with camping gear and supplies in early spring, but no one knew where he had gone. While the search for Thompson continued, forensic specialists made another crucial discovery. Hidden in a waterproof pouch found with Nina's remains was a damaged but partially readable journal. The entries from her final days painted a terrifying picture of manipulation and deception. Nina had apparently been contacted by Thompson, who convinced her to modify her planned route to include a secret location that he claimed few people had ever seen. The journal entries showed Nina's initial excitement about the opportunity to explore a hidden area that would provide unique content for her blog. Thompson had presented himself as a licensed guide, offering a discounted rate in exchange for promotional consideration on her popular travel blog. He had convinced her to meet him at a location outside her planned route, promising to show her places that would transform her Alaska expedition from routine hiking into something truly extraordinary. Nina's final journal entries revealed growing concern about Thompson's behavior once they had met in person. She described him as increasingly controlling and inappropriate, making comments that made her uncomfortable and suggesting changes to their plans that would take them even further from established trails. Her last entry, written in hurried handwriting that suggested fear or stress, mentioned that she was planning to end the guided portion of her trip and return to her original solo route. If you're gripped by this incredible investigation and want to see how detectives piece together these complex wilderness crimes, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. These cases show just how dangerous it can be when predators use our love of nature against us. The journal provided the missing link that explained how Nina had ended up so far from her planned route. Thompson had systematically manipulated her trust, using her passion for exploration and her desire to create engaging content to lure her into an increasingly dangerous situation. The remote location where her body was found was almost certainly one of Thompson's secret destinations, a place he could control completely without fear of witnesses or interruption. Armed with this new evidence, law enforcement agencies across Alaska and Western Canada began coordinating their efforts to locate Thompson. His truck was added to law enforcement databases, and his known associates were interviewed extensively. The investigation revealed that Thompson had been operating his illegal guide service for over 15 years, targeting solo travelers who were seeking extreme wilderness experiences and were willing to trust someone who claimed expertise in hidden locations. Detective Powell felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with a breaking case. After 3 years of dead ends and cold leads, they finally had a suspect, a motive, and evidence of premeditation. The challenge now was finding a man who knew Alaska's wilderness better than almost anyone and who had demonstrated a willingness to kill to protect his secrets. The manhunt for Bear Thompson became one of the largest wilderness searches in Alaska's history, but this time law enforcement was hunting a predator rather than searching for a victim. The challenge was immense. Thompson possessed intimate knowledge of remote areas that even experienced Alaska state troopers had never seen, and his decades of guiding illegal expeditions had given him a network of hidden camps and supply caches throughout the wilderness. He was essentially invisible in a landscape where most people would die within days. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Thompson's illegal guiding operation had required supplies, and despite his nomadic lifestyle, he maintained relationships with several remote lodge owners who operated far from traditional oversight. Detective Powell's team discovered that Thompson had a standing arrangement with a hunting lodge owner named Curtis Wade, who allowed Thompson to resupply at his remote facility in exchange for occasional guide services for Wade's most adventurous clients. Wade initially claimed ignorance about Thompson's activities, insisting he knew him only as an experienced wilderness guide who helped with difficult clients. However, when confronted with the evidence of Thompson's connection to multiple missing persons cases, Wade's story began to crumble. Under pressure from federal investigators, he admitted that Thompson had contacted him in recent weeks, requesting supplies for an extended wilderness expedition that would keep him off the grid indefinitely. More importantly, Wade revealed the location of Thompson's most remote cache, a hidden supply depot located in a nearly inaccessible valley deep in the Alaska Range. Thompson had spent years developing this location as his ultimate refuge, a place where he could disappear completely if his illegal activities were ever discovered. Wade provided detailed directions to the cache, along with information about Thompson's supply schedule and movement patterns. A joint task force of Alaska State Troopers, FBI agents, and specialized wilderness tracking units was assembled for the operation. The remote location meant that helicopter insertion was the only practical approach, but the terrain was so challenging that even experienced pilots considered it extremely dangerous. The team included Detective Powell, who had requested to be part of the arrest operation that would close her most frustrating case. The helicopter approach was conducted in the pre-dawn hours of a crisp October morning, when thermal imaging would be most effective at detecting human heat signatures in the cold wilderness. The aircraft flew in formation, using night vision equipment to navigate through mountain passes that were barely wide enough to accommodate their rotors. As they approached the target valley, thermal scanners detected a heat signature near the location Wade had identified. Thompson's camp was a masterpiece of wilderness concealment, hidden beneath natural rock overhangs and camouflaged with materials that made it nearly invisible from above. The setup revealed the mind of someone who had been planning for this moment for years. Multiple escape routes led away from the camp, and emergency supplies were cached at strategic points throughout the surrounding terrain. This wasn't the camp of a casual wilderness enthusiast. It was the refuge of a man who understood that eventually, his crimes would catch up with him. The arrest operation required careful coordination to prevent Thompson from escaping into terrain where he would have significant advantages over his pursuers. Teams were inserted at multiple points around the valley, creating a containment perimeter while the primary arrest team approached the camp directly. As the sun rose over the jagged peaks surrounding the valley, Thompson emerged from his shelter to discover that his years of hiding were over. The confrontation was anticlimactic. Thompson, faced with overwhelming evidence and no possibility of escape, surrendered without resistance. Detective Powell would later describe the moment as strangely peaceful, watching this dangerous predator calmly raise his hands in the place where he had thought he was untouchable. The man who had spent decades using Alaska's wilderness to conceal his crimes was finally trapped by that same wilderness. Thompson's initial questioning revealed the scope of his criminal activities. Over nearly 2 decades, he had used his illegal guide service to target vulnerable travelers, particularly young women hiking alone who were seeking authentic wilderness experiences. His method was sophisticated and patient. He would identify potential victims through online hiking forums and travel blogs, establish contact under the guise of offering local expertise, and gradually build trust before suggesting modifications to their planned routes that would isolate them completely. Nina Caldwell had been Thompson's most recent victim, but she wasn't his first. During extensive interrogation, he provided information about at least 6 other missing persons cases that had been classified as wilderness accidents over the past 15 years. Each victim had been lured away from established trails with promises of unique experiences and secret locations. Thompson's knowledge of remote areas and his ability to manipulate his victims' trust had created the perfect hunting ground for a wilderness predator. The confession was methodical and chillingly detailed. Thompson described how he had contacted Nina through her blog, carefully studying her posts to understand her motivations and desires. He had presented himself as a legitimate guide who was impressed by her adventurous spirit and wanted to show her places that would provide extraordinary content for her readers. Nina's trust in the outdoor community and her desire to create unique content had made her an ideal victim for his manipulation. Thompson admitted to meeting Nina at a predetermined location far from her planned route, convincing her that the detour would add valuable material to her Alaska expedition. Over the course of 2 days, he had led her deeper into remote wilderness, gradually revealing his true intentions as they moved further from any possibility of rescue or escape. The attack occurred at a remote campsite near Mirror Lake, where Thompson had killed previous victims and perfected his body disposal methods. The detailed confession allowed investigators to locate and recover the remains of 3 other victims, young hikers whose disappearances had never been connected until Thompson's arrest. Each case followed the same pattern of online grooming, trust building, and ultimate betrayal in locations so remote that their screams would never be heard by another living person. The recovery operations provided closure for families who had spent years wondering about the fate of their loved ones. Thompson's trial became a landmark case in the prosecution of wilderness crimes. The evidence was overwhelming, including physical evidence from multiple crime scenes, detailed confessions, and testimony from lodge owners and equipment suppliers who had unknowingly supported his illegal activities. The case highlighted the unique vulnerabilities faced by solo travelers in remote areas and led to new safety protocols for wilderness recreation. For Robert Caldwell, Thompson's conviction provided a different kind of closure than he had anticipated. The knowledge that his daughter had been murdered was devastating, but understanding the truth allowed him to process his grief in a way that years of uncertainty had prevented. He established the Nina Caldwell Wilderness Safety Foundation, an organization dedicated to educating solo travelers about the risks of trusting strangers in remote locations and promoting safety protocols that might prevent future tragedies. The foundation worked with law enforcement agencies to develop screening procedures for wilderness guides and created educational materials that helped travelers distinguish between legitimate guide services and potentially dangerous operators like Thompson. Robert's work transformed his personal tragedy into a mission that honored his daughter's memory while potentially saving other lives. Detective Powell reflected on the case as one of the most complex and satisfying of her career, despite its tragic nature. The investigation had required coordination between multiple agencies, innovative forensic techniques, and the kind of patient detective work that slowly assembled a complete picture from fragments of evidence scattered across thousands of miles of wilderness. Most importantly, it had demonstrated that even in Alaska's vast wilderness, justice was still possible for those who used isolation and remoteness to conceal their crimes. This incredible case shows us how dangerous it can be when predators exploit our trust and love of adventure. If this story has captivated you and you want to hear more shocking true crime cases that will leave you speechless, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that bell icon so you never miss our latest investigations into the most mysterious disappearances and shocking crimes. Thompson was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole, ensuring that Alaska's wilderness would never again be stalked by this particular predator. His conviction closed multiple cold cases and provided answers to families who had endured years of agonizing uncertainty. The case also served as a sobering reminder that the very qualities that draw people to wilderness adventure, the trust in strangers and the willingness to explore unknown places, could also make them vulnerable to those who understood how to exploit such trust for evil purposes. Nina Caldwell's story ended not with the adventure she had planned, but with justice served and a legacy that would help protect future travelers from predators who lurked in the shadows of America's most beautiful and remote places. Her red sleeping bag, once a symbol of adventure and exploration, had become the evidence that finally brought her killer to justice and ensured that her death would not be in vain.